is where we'll spend most of our time. But you may want to go ahead and find Acts 16. If you want to go find that one, that'd be good as well. We've been talking about the letter to the Philippians for some time now, but I hadn't told you a whole lot about Philippi, the city. Most of what I knew about Philippi was from Scripture, but if you look into the origins of the city and the great events that happened in the city of Philippi, and I know some of you are going to be probably more familiar with this than I am, but bear with me for just a second. If you love war and fights and military battles, things like that, and struggles, then you would love a place like Philippi. It's named after Philip of Macedon, who was the dad of Alexander the Great, one of the greatest warriors, I think, who's ever lived, but that was several centuries before the events I'm about to tell you about. About 42, 43 BC, there was a great battle in the city of Philippi. It's called the Battle of Philippi. And this is in response to the death of Julius Caesar, which you may be familiar with. And so the Battle of Philippi around 42 BC is one of the great battles in Roman history. 200,000 people or so are engaged in this war, bringing revenge for the death of Julius Caesar. And so on one side, you've got Mark Antony and you got Augustus, who are trying to avenge the death of Julius Caesar. And on the other side, you've got Brutus and Cassius, who are the ones who are having to defend themselves. Mark Antony and Augustus have 110,000 soldiers at their disposal. Brutus and Cassius have about 90,000 soldiers at their disposal. So 200,000 men fighting in the city of Philippi, for the city of Philippi. 40,000 of them die. 20% of the people fighting in that battle, they die as a result of this. It's an incredibly bloody battle that happens in Philippi. But what eventually happens is Mark Antony and Augustus, they win this thing, and it is most would say, I think it's the kind of end of the Roman Republic, and it's the beginning of the Roman Empire. And so things are spreading, they're building, things are growing, and before you know it, it becomes the Roman Empire that we maybe are a bit more familiar with, that rules tons and tons of lands and tons of people throughout the empire, throughout Europe and places around there. A lot of those soldiers would settle in Philippi. That's where the battle was. And so a lot of those soldiers who were steeped in violence and war rhetoric would stop and take their leave in Philippi, and they would remain there. So that's kind of what makes up the city of Philippi. Well, why is that important? That's important for a number of reasons. Because one day, a man named Paul would come to town. And you can read about this in Acts chapter 16. This is about 80 years after that battle of Philippi, around about 80 years or so. And so you got this city of Philippi that's a hub into Europe for the Roman Empire. And you've got Paul in Acts 16, who's the apostle to the Gentiles, the non-Jews, and he has made it into Philippi. As his custom was, he's looking for people who will listen to his gospel message. And he finds a woman down by the riverside at the time of prayer. In fact, lots of women who were gathered there at the time of prayer. And this lady named Lydia, a seller of purple, listens to Paul. And she hears some of the things that Paul is saying. She wants to know more, and so they dialogue with one another. And before you know it, Lydia and her household are baptized into Christ. And her household is, the first conversion to Christianity in Europe, as we know it. It's first conversion to Christianity in Europe. And then Paul and Silas and their band are going around town, and they're talking to people about the gospel. There's this slave girl who is entrapped by her owners, and they free her. And the owners are not so upset about what's happened to the girl, except they've lost money. And so they get really upset with Paul and Silas, and they throw them in jail. Not because they cast out a demon or anything, but because their source of income, this little slave girl, is now gone. They can't do anything with her anymore. And so Paul and Silas are in jail in Acts 16. And in the latter half of Acts 16, you find Paul and Silas singing hymns in jail. And as they're doing that, earthquake happens. They could have run away. They decide not to. The Philippian jailer thinks everybody's gone, that he's going to die as a result of this anyway. And he's ready to fall on his sword. But Paul says, stop it. Don't do that. There's no need. We're here. We're not leaving. In that very hour of the night, Paul speaks the gospel to this Philippian jailer. We don't know his name, but we know that very hour of the night, they go out, he and his household, and they are all baptized into Christ. As far as we know, second family that becomes a Christian within Europe is the Philippian jailer and his family. Before you know it, Paul's departing. He's going on to different places, Acts 17 and onward. But that is the beginning, the origin story of the church at Philippi. Why is that important, you may ask? Glad you asked. It's important because you got this city here that's a very prominent city in the Roman Empire. It has been for some time now. And now you got Christians there. First ones. The first European Christians, the first church in Europe is in Philippi. And Philippi is a place where paganism abounds, as in many places in the Roman Empire. And now you got a Christian influence there. The only community of Christ followers in pagan Rome is right here. And here's what we can know about them. They are first in Europe, so they're not going to get any help from Christians around them probably at that time. That would grow. They would plant more churches. But on the front end, there's nobody. They are it. They are it. They're not getting help from the government. In fact, at many times they are shunned by the government. They're not getting help from their fellow citizens of Philippi because they may have been kind of blackballed by those folks. And so what you have is a poor group of Christians in Philippi. Now, the surrounding culture was not poor. They were somewhat affluent. They had money. They had the spoils of war, some of them did. But they were not helping the Christians. In fact, when Paul writes his second letter to the Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and chapter 9, he's writing to them in order to get them to generously give to support some poor Christians around the globe. And it just so happens that those poor Christians are the residents probably of Philippi. In 2 Corinthians 8, verses 1 and 2, he speaks about the generosity of the poor saints in Macedonia. Well, Philippi is Macedonia. This is the group that he's talking about. And he talks about out of their poverty, they give, not out of their abundance or all the things that they've got, but they're poor, and they still find ways to be generous. And so you got a city with pagan roots. You got the first church planted in Europe in Philippi. They're a relatively poor group of folks. And if that's not bad enough, before you know it, there are people infiltrating the church, bringing some kind of false teaching. I'd like for you to read this with me. It's in Philippians chapter 3. And Paul's going to hit on a couple of things in this one chapter. He says in Philippians chapter 3, verse 1, "Finally, my brothers," he's about to start bringing the letter to a close, latter two chapters, "rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things to you is no trouble to me, and it's safe for you." And so here's what he says. Look out for the dogs. He's not talking about animals. He's talking about people. Watch out for the dogs. Look out for the evildoers. Look out for those who mutilate the flesh. Now, we got to do a little digging to find out what he's talking about, but he's talking about what we used to call the Judaizers, the people who would come and instead of just the gospel of Christ, they would say what you really need is the gospel of Jesus plus some other laws and some restrictions. Here, specifically, he's got in mind the rite of circumcision. That's a Jewish thought. And so Paul says, you got to watch out. All right, you're a church, you're a body of Christian believers here. You got to watch out for people who are coming in and they are teaching you the wrong things. Here's what he says about them later on in the same chapter, verse 17. He says, "Brothers, join in imitating me and keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us." That's good, but it's not all good. Verse 18, "For many of whom I've often told you and now tell you, even with tears, they walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their end is destruction. Their God is their belly. Their glory is their shame. And their minds are set on earthly things." These are folks who are seemingly making their way into this Philippian body of believers, and they are infiltrating them with some false ideas about what it means to be a Christian, what it means to follow Jesus. All right? And Paul says, he says it more explicitly in other letters like Galatians, but here, he's pretty clear in saying you got to watch out for those evildoers, what he calls the dogs, the enemies of the cross who come and say that your simple faith in Christ is not enough. You need more. You need to add our rules and our stipulations and all the statutes that we're comfortable with so that you can be right with God. He says, watch out for those folks. And so you got that going on in the church. And then finally, if that's not bad enough, you got a pagan city, you got a seemingly singular church here in Philippi with a whole lot of support from anybody around them. As a result, they're poor folks in this congregation. They're dealing with some false teachers. And if that isn't bad enough, from their very own ranks, they've got people spreading some divisive things. And so in chapter 2, Paul begins by saying, hey, if your Christianity means anything to you, if God means anything to you, if Jesus means anything to you, if there's any comfort in the Spirit, any consolation, please have the same love. Be in full accord and of one mind. Now, he wouldn't say that unless they were not in one accord and of the same mind. They had problems. They were disagreeing. They had discord. There was disunity in the church. And so Paul says, here's the instruction, verse 3, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. That's tough. Right? But if you want to overcome discord, disunity, here's the recipe from Paul. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. That's chapter 2. If you flip over to chapter 4, he mentions a couple of them by name. And I've wondered, why does he do that? Why not just say, some of y'all are, like he does with the Corinthians. I've heard that y'all aren't getting along very well, and some are, love this brand and some love that brand of Christianity. I've heard that about y'all. Paul didn't do that here. He mentions two people. Philippians 2, verse 2, or 4, I'm sorry. Philippians 4, verse 2. He says, I entreat Euodia and I entreat Syntyche to agree in the Lord. And I ask you also, true companion, to help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel together with Clement and with the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows what their disagreement was. But they got it. There's some disunity here. There's some discord. You got people who are at odds with one another. And so you got this church out of pagan roots, localized, kind of alone there in Europe. First one there, poor group of folks dealing with some false teachers. They got some discord and they've got some disunity. Man. Doesn't that sound like a difficult church? Or does it kind of sound like a lot of us? Like a lot of our churches. And so what does Paul say to these folks? This is the story of the Philippian church, and this, in a lot of ways, is the story of us. There are parts of this Philippian story within all of us, right? And so what does Paul say to a group of folks like that? All right, with that, I would draw your attention back to Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16 that Pete read for us just a few minutes ago. Philippians 2, verses 14 through 16. There are a lot of problems. And Paul's he's gonna focus on this phrase, a crooked and perverse generation. In fact, let's just go to verse 14. Do all things without grumbling or disputing. I'm going to save that line to the very end. We'll come back to it. Do that you may be blameless, innocent, children of God, without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. When you hear that word, that phrase, a crooked and twisted generation, what comes to your mind? Now, what do we think about when we think about things that are crooked? What do we think about when we think about things that are perverse in our lives, in our world? Hopefully you've got some things in your mind. Crooked is the original Greek scolios. And if you listen to that closely, you can hear scoliosis, a curvature of the spine. And so the word crooked means bent or twisted or deviated from the standard. Perverse simply means distorted. Perverse is not anything sexual in nature, just inherently. It's distorted from what it was meant to be. So you put those words together. We are in the middle of a bent, twisted, deviated from the standard, distorted generation in Philippi. What about ours? What about ours? Do you know anything evil that we call good sometimes? Do you know good things that sometimes people look at as evil things? I bet we do. I bet we could name some, probably list out a few of those things. That's our generation. And it's easy, right? If I ask you, hey, let's make a list of 10 crooked or perverse things in our generation, I bet we could come up with a list of 10 pretty quickly. We could probably do that. But did you know the first time anybody in the Bible talked about a crooked and perverse generation, it was not about them. It was not about the world out there. It was about the people of God. It comes from Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 5, and this is one of Moses' last speeches before the people of God, before they go over into the promised land. And in Deuteronomy 32, verse 5, Moses talks about a crooked and perverse generation as one that was made up of the people of God who stopped following him for whatever reason. It was made up of the people who were called out of Egypt and made it through the land of promise with a cloudy, fiery pillar, but for whatever reason, they were, in Moses' words, a crooked and perverse lot who decided not to follow God's will and God's ways any longer. You see, when we talk about a crooked and perverse generation, let's don't just think about them out there. Let's think about us. The first use of the phrase was about the people of God. And so I can't just stand up here and point the finger at a failing world of darkness. I could, but that doesn't do us any good. We know that. What we ought to do is think of ourselves as well. Crooked and perverse, bent, twisted, deviated from the standard, distorted. And what Paul means is we are in this world and everything's all out of sorts. It's upside down. It's not how it should be. It's deviated from the standard. It's twisted. It's distorted. Things are not as we wish they were. That's true of the world. And let's be honest, sometimes that is true of the church as well. What I think's happening is that people in our world are looking for something better than that. What I think I see in our world today is that people are looking for something better in the world, and they're looking for something better when it comes to Christianity as well. Something true, something that is real. I think we're becoming more and more tired of the crooked and perverse ways of our world and of our lives. I think we're becoming tired of those things, and we want to find a way out of the darkness. I think people want light. And one of the things Paul is trying to get across to these Philippian Christians is that if everybody in the world out there in Philippi is arguing and complaining and disputing and nobody can get along, then what light is the church in the middle of that darkness? Or if everybody out there in the world has, these immoral standards, then what light is there in the church against the backdrop of that kind of darkness? That's the world that we live in. And so I would ask you, if what we do at church a lot of times consists of grumbling and disputing and arguing and complaining and pointing fingers and all of that, then what do we have to shine as a light against the backdrop of a dark world who already has plenty of that kind of stuff? Shouldn't we be better than that? Shouldn't we strive for something better than that? And so Paul writes to them, and he doesn't just tell them kind of what the generation is like. He says, here's what you should be in this crooked and dark world. It's the end of verse 15. You shine as lights in the world. You shine as lights in the world. This picture, this phrasing is not at all new to Paul. All right, he uses it here, and he uses it in a very effective way, but he rips it out of some other places that are very prominent in Scripture. Let's start at Matthew chapter 5. This is the place in Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, you are the light of the world. And that's groundbreaking to the people who heard it for the first time. All right, they had concepts from places like Isaiah 49 verse 3 where they were supposed to be. There was a group of people who was supposed to be a light to the nations, a light to the Gentiles, to show all the world what God is like. That's the priestly function of Israel, was to show the world what God is like. They somewhat failed in that. And so in Matthew 5, Jesus has called what amounts to a ragtag group of disciples up to a mountain. There are crowds around him. He's called his disciples the fishermen of the world, the tax collectors of the world, many of them hated and despised by the world. And he calls them up on the mountain and he says, you are the light of the world. Nobody lights a candle and puts it under a bushel. Instead, we take it up, we put it on a pedestal, and it gives light for everybody in the house to see. And Jesus says, that is you. You don't think you are, right? Most people don't think you are, but that is you, Jesus says. You are the light of the world. So here's what you do about it. Verse 16, you let your light shine. By doing what? Do your good works. Go about your life and do good things. Do good things. And people see it, and they take note of that. And it shines as a light in the world. And people will come to glorify your Father in heaven by what they see you do. Go shine as lights in the middle of a dark and perverse generation. You are the light of the world, the light of the world, the singular source of light in the darkness. Daniel uses the phrase back in Daniel chapter 12, verse 3, as that book comes to a close. And in Daniel 12, verse 3, the phrase is not light of the world or shine like lights in the world. Daniel says, you will shine like stars. And the people that Daniel most explicitly has in mind are people who are wise, people who know and apply the word of God to their lives. And so Daniel could look around, and Isaiah can look around, and Jesus can look around, and Paul can look around, and you and I, we can look around, and we can see a lot of darkness in our world. And the call of all of these folks is you go live a new life. You live a different kind of life. You do different things in your life. You speak different things in your life. You go about your life showing what new life is like in a world that only knows the way to death. That's our world. That's what we live in. What's it look like in our world? Well, do you know anybody who has this great thirst for power? Do you know anybody who has a great thirst for money, financial stuff, greed? Do you know somebody? They may be sitting in your seat in the pew this morning who struggles with power or greed or lust or anything like that. What would it look like to shine as lights against that darkness? What would it look like to shine as lights in our world that is fueled by, many times, struggles for power, for money, for love, for lust? Could you consider with me, just for a final few moments this morning, that maybe we're here today in the middle of what you and I may describe as a perverse, crooked, bent out of shape, deviated from the standard, all kinds of distorted, not at all like it should be, dark world. We may be in that kind of world today. Could it be that we are right where we need to be? People to shine as lights in the middle of a dark world. So what do? Well, Jesus was pretty clear. You do good works to shine your light. Okay, that's pretty broad. Do good stuff, shine the light. Paul zeroes in on it. And in Philippians chapter 2, I think Paul gives us some things we can hold on to and talk about what it may look like in our world to shine as lights. It may be what we read earlier in Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4, that we don't consider ourselves first anymore. And I don't think about what I want anymore. I think about others. That's humility. I consider the interests of others. I consider the personhood of somebody else. And if need be, I guess I'm willing to sacrifice what I want, what's for the good of somebody else. In a dark world where we strive for ourselves all the time, wouldn't that look like a bright light? One thing Paul says. He strings together a list of words in verse 15. I'd like for us to read it again. Blameless. This is the second part here, what I call it holiness, mainly because it starts with an H, and I needed an H word. Blameless, innocent, children of God without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. Think about those words. Blameless, innocent, virtuous. But Tim just said we weren't perfect, right? I just heard Tim stand up here and say, if you're looking for a perfect group of people, you found the wrong one. The same man who wrote about let's be blameless and innocent is the same man who wrote that he was also the chief of sinners. Least of all the apostles, Paul writes about himself. And so the call to holiness and sanctification is not a declaration that we're going to be perfect from now on, that I'm never going to mess up, right? Tim's an elder. He gets up here and he says, we're not perfect. None of us are. We all mess up. We make mistakes. Errors in judgment. We all do it. Sin. We all mess up. We miss the mark. We fall short. We don't live up to our name as Christian. We don't always conform ourselves perfectly to the image of Jesus. Nobody does. I'm your preacher, and I can say the same thing. There are times that I have to preach messages on issues that I struggle with, and I got to go home, and I've got to face people who know that sometimes I get a little bit too upset, too easy. And I just preached a sermon on anger, and I'm not perfect in that area. We strive for it. We strive for that. We long for that. We try in the middle of our world to be perfect and blameless, without blemish, without spot. We try for that. We're never going to get it. We can get closer. I can do better today than I did yesterday and better tomorrow than hopefully I do today, but hey, it's a progression. Paul says we strive for holiness and sanctification, blameless, innocent, a virtuous life, but we are not perfect. If we were, where would be the need for grace and forgiveness and forbearance? And so Paul says, you want to shine as lights? Then strive for holiness and sanctification. And when you mess it all up, admit it. Don't cover it up. Don't act like it didn't happen. Admit it. Learn the lesson. Move on. That's why Paul can say, hey, I'm the chief of sinners. Chief of sinners. There's none worse than I am, but I still press on for a higher call. And so Paul says, you want to shine as lights? Admit the flaws, the mistakes, the errors that we make, the sin in our lives, and strive for holy, sanctified lives. And then he gets into this business about joy again. He hits it a lot. I think I said 14 times he mentions joy in this letter. It may be 16 times. But here's how he does it here. Philippians 2, verse 17. Even if I, Paul says, am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, then I'm glad and I rejoice with you all. Even if this imprisonment, Paul says, is leading to my death. And if I'm going to be poured out, then I rejoice with you. And likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me. Well, hold on a minute. We got a whole list of things that we could be upset about if we're in Philippi. I'm in the middle of a dark and perverse and twisted, distorted world. We got pagan roots. We're a poor lot of people. We got false teachers coming in and teaching us all kinds of garbage. And we got division and disunity within our church. What do you mean? Be happy, be filled with joy. Paul says, look, that's how you shine as lights in this world. You may have a lot of things that are struggles. You may have a lot of things that are problems. But you find a way to rejoice even in the middle of all of those struggles. Humble, holy, and a happy group of people will stick out like a sore thumb. They'll shine as lights in a dark and perverse world. Let me ask you, is it easy to do that? Is it easy to live with humility, to strive for holiness, and find ways to be happy even when on the surface it seems like there's not a whole lot to be happy about? It's not easy. You know what is easy? Philippians 2:14 is easy. Well, the opposite of Philippians 2:14 is easy. Paul says, do all things without grumbling and complaining. The grumbling and the complaining, that's the easy thing. Look at these people around us. They're all pagan. I can complain about that. Philippians could have. Look at what we got in life. We got nothing. While everybody around us, they're prospering. I could complain and grumble about that a little bit if I'm a Philippian Christian. Can you believe the elders let that false teacher in here? I could complain about that if I was a Philippian. I can't believe Euodia and Syntyche, after all the things they've done together, all the good they've accomplished, all the work they've done, that they can't even get along right now. I could complain and grumble about that. There's a lot of stuff that these Philippian Christians could find to grumble and complain about. If you look closely enough at your life, you can find something to grumble and complain about. If you look closely enough at somebody else's life, you can find the same thing. If you look closely enough at any church, this one included, you can find something to grumble and complain about. It's going to happen. It's who we are. We're humans. But specifically, if we're looking for what it may look like to live with humility and a striving for holiness and finding joy and happiness wherever it may be found, it may just be as simple as let's commit to doing all things. All things means all things. Do it without grumbling and complaining or disputing. Might this be one of the more common, overlooked sins of our day? Do you have anything to complain about today? Anything just not going your way? Wake up today and things are just not how they ought to be. You're not really getting what you want. Feeling a little unfulfilled. Got anything to complain or grumble or dispute about today? Can I challenge you to think about how you respond when you don't get what you want? When you don't get what you think is best? Can I challenge you further to do all things without grumbling and complaining? And if you can find a way to do it, my guess is that you will begin to shine brightly as a light in the middle of darkness. What the world needs to see is humble, holy, joyful lives from people who follow Jesus. That is how we shine as lights in the middle of a dark, crooked, perverse generation. So what about you? Got anything going wrong? Anything to complain about? What will you do with it? You may be here today and you're ready to become a Christian. You're ready to begin this kind of life of following Christ, of submitting humbly to Him, to living out His will in your life, to striving for holiness and sanctification and a blemishless life, a perfection life. We're not going to get there, but we strive for it all the time, and that's light in the darkness. Maybe you're ready for that, and you're ready to be baptized into Christ, where the sins and the guilt and the past is removed, and we come out of the waters ready to live this kind of life of humble service to our King. You could be here today and you're a Christian, but for whatever reason, we haven't shined a whole lot like a light in a dark world, and there are things that we want to get right. And maybe that means you're praying about that by yourself. Maybe that means you incorporate all of us to pray for you to be a light in this dark world. There could be something else happening in your life and in your world that none of us know anything about, but you want to be praying about it and you want us to pray as well. And so